Mister,
Maybe you need
maybe
this.
you need this.
The little girl stood in front of him with both hands wrapped around a cold plastic bottle of water, her dark eyes wide but steady. You should drink some, she said softly. You can take it, I didn't open it yet. Daniel Whitmore looked at her as if he could not quite understand why she was standing there. His white dress shirt was wrinkled and damp at the collar. His tie hung loose and crooked. His suit jacket had slipped halfway off the back of a molded plastic chair. His jaw was tight, his eyes red-rimmed, and his voice had already been driven raw by anger. You brought that for me? He asked. The child nodded. Yes, sir. Why? Before she could answer, the older woman near the coffee station took 2 cautious steps closer. Sweetheart, she said to the girl in a low voice. You should stay away from him. He was shouting at people out here a little while ago. A tall man beside her nodded. That's right. He just calmed down. Don't go upsetting him again, honey. Another visitor passing by added. Go on back to your seat, little one. Let that gentleman be. Daniel's face hardened with humiliation. The shame of being discussed like a public disturbance cut through what little self-control he still had left. I said go away, he snapped, turning on them with enough force to make all 3 of them step back. He pointed toward the waiting area without caring who saw. All of you, go sit somewhere else and leave me alone. Right now. They did. The couple moved off immediately, whispering to each other. The passing visitor muttered, Lord have mercy, under his breath, and kept walking. A nurse who had started toward Daniel stopped in place and turned back toward her station, but the little girl did not move. You should still drink some, she said, quieter now. Your voice sounds like it hurts. Daniel gave a short, bitter exhale that almost became a laugh and then died in his throat. I'm not thirsty, he said, refusing the bottle with a slight push of his hand. Keep it. The child lowered the bottle a little, though she didn't step back. Okay, she said. Only then did Daniel really notice her. And she was alone. Daniel opened his mouth to ask where her family was. But before he could speak, the double doors at the far end of the corridor opened and Dr. Helen Strauss came toward him again, followed by a younger doctor and 2 nurses. Hope rose so fast in him it hurt. He stood. What is it? Are you taking him in now? Dr. Strauss stopped a few feet away. Her face was composed, but there was a new tightness around her mouth. Mr. Whitmore, she said carefully, there's been another issue in the operating room. A piece of equipment is still being recalibrated, and anesthesiology wants one more check before your son is moved in. We need you to wait a little longer. For a second, Daniel simply stared at her. Then his face changed. No. Mr. Whitmore? No. His voice cracked across the hallway. No. You already told me he was going in. You told me the room was ready. It was nearly ready, the younger doctor began. Daniel turned on him so fast the man visibly flinched. Nearly ready? Daniel barked. My son is lying in there, and you're telling me nearly ready? Sir, we're doing everything we can, one of the nurses said. He let out a furious curse, then another, loud, ugly, helpless words that bounced off the white walls and made people lower their eyes. Everything you can, he shouted. That's what people say when they don't know what the hell they're doing. Every 10 minutes it's another delay. Another excuse. Another apology. My son is back there waiting while all of you stand here feeding me the same polished nonsense. Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Strauss said, voice firm now. We will not rush a procedure on your child to satisfy your anger. He cursed again, rougher this time, then dragged his hand down his face, as though trying to wipe the panic off his skin. The doctors and nurses exchanged weary looks. We're sorry, sir, the younger doctor said. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, one nurse added softly. We truly are sorry. They stepped away at last, their professional calm fraying at the edges as they turned back toward the operating room. Their voices dropped, but not so low that Daniel couldn't hear the murmuring. He's losing it. Can you blame him? No, but we can't keep doing this. Just give it 5 more minutes. Then they were gone. Daniel stood there another second, breathing hard, before the anger drained out of him so suddenly it left him hollow. He sank into one of the plastic chairs, elbows on his knees, both hands over his face. The little girl still hadn't moved. The hallway returned to its usual rhythm. A cart squeaked by in the distance. The television droned on overhead. Somewhere down another corridor, An intercom called for respiratory therapy. But under all of that, Daniel could hear the dryness in his own throat, the ache it left behind from all the shouting. His mouth felt like paper. He swallowed once and felt nothing. He lowered his hands and looked at the bottle again. The child was still holding it. For the first time all night, his voice came out without force. "Do you still have that water?" She nodded at once. "Yes, sir." Daniel hesitated, pride collapsing under something as simple and human as thirst. "Could I have it?" She stepped closer and held it out with both hands. "Yes, sir." This time he took it. His fingers brushed hers, cool from the condensation. He twisted the cap off and drank hard. Too quickly. In deep, desperate pulls. He didn't sip. He gulped. Water ran cold down his throat, and he kept drinking until he had to stop for breath. When he finally lowered the bottle, he pressed it briefly against his forehead and closed his eyes. The child watched him with quiet approval, as if something had just been put back where it belonged. "Thank you," Daniel said, voice still rough. "You're welcome." He studied her more carefully now. "What's your name?" "Annie Carter." Daniel nodded once. Then Annie tipped her head a little and asked the question no adult in the hallway had dared ask. "What happened?" He looked at her, and for one terrible moment he tried to answer like a man who still had control over himself. But he didn't. His face folded. His mouth trembled. Then all at once the sound that came out of him was not the sharp bark of a powerful man giving orders. It was a broken, helpless sob. Daniel bent forward, one hand gripping the water bottle. The other braced against his knee as he cried openly in the middle of the hallway. He cried like a father whose strength had run out. His shoulders shook, his breath hitched. "My son," he said at last, the words torn out between breaths. "My boy is back there. He's 8. His name is Ethan." He dragged in air and let out another strangled sob. "They keep telling me to wait. They keep telling me they need more time. And I can't do anything." He covered his eyes with one hand, crying harder now, his voice rising with the humiliation of it. "Do you understand that? I can buy buildings, I can move money, I can hire the best people in the world, and none of it means a damn thing if they can't save my son." Annie stood perfectly still, listening. Daniel tried to steady himself, failed, and cried again, louder this time. "I'm his father," Daniel said hoarsely. "I'm supposed to protect him. I'm supposed to fix things, and all I can do is sit out here and wait while strangers decide whether my little boy lives through the night." He bowed his head and wept, the bottle still clutched in his hand. When the storm of it eased enough for him to breathe again, he looked up at Annie with wet, reddened eyes. For the first time that night, his face held no anger at all, only exhaustion and grief. Then he asked in a quieter voice, "Why are you here, Annie?" She shifted the strap of her backpack on her shoulder. "My mama got real sick at home," she said. "The ambulance brought her. They took her to emergency, and a nurse told me to wait here where it was quieter." She glanced down the hall as if she could see through the walls to where her mother was. "My auntie's coming. She's bringing money." Daniel stared at her. Annie looked back at him with those solemn dark eyes. "They said my mama needs help fast," she went on. "I'm trying to be good and wait." Something tightened hard in Daniel's chest. Under the bright lights of that expensive hospital, with the half-empty water bottle bulgent in his hand and tears still wet on his face, he saw the truth of the night more clearly than he had seen anything in years. He was not the only person in that building terrified of losing someone. And somehow, in the middle of his fear, the first person to show him compassion was a little girl waiting for her aunt to bring money so her mother could continue her treatment. Daniel sat there, holding a nearly empty bottle, his throat finally easing, but his chest still tight. He looked at Annie, then glanced toward the emergency room, even though he couldn't see it from where they were sitting. "How long have you been here alone?" Annie lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "A while." That answer hit him almost harder than the tears had. A nurse with a kind, square face and soft brown hair pulled under a scrub cap stepped out from behind the station and approached with measured care. Daniel had seen her earlier moving in and out of the hallway with the kind of efficiency that made people trust a place more than it deserved. She carried a sealed carton of milk and a small pack of crackers in one hand. "There you are," she said to Annie. her voice warm but not pitying. I was wondering if you'd eaten anything. Annie looked at the crackers, then at Daniel, as though uncertain whether taking food in front of him was rude. It's all right, the nurse said, kneeling slightly so her face was closer to Annie's. These are for you. Annie accepted them with both hands. Thank you. The nurse smiled. You're welcome, honey. Then she straightened and looked at Daniel. Unlike the others, she did not appear intimidated by him now. Tired, perhaps. Cautious, certainly. But not intimidated. Mr. Whitmore. He nodded once, too worn out for pride. Nurse, Paula Bennett. Thank you, he said, and to his own surprise he meant not just the crackers. Paula gave him the briefest look, as if recognizing that something in him had shifted, then glanced toward the hall leading to emergency. Her mother's still being evaluated. I checked again about 10 minutes ago. No update yet. Daniel looked at Annie. You knew that? Annie nodded and started opening the crackers with painstaking concentration. The lady told me. Paula rested one hand against the edge of the nurse's station and lowered her voice. We tried calling the aunt again. No answer so far. But the number is in the chart. She hesitated. The admitting team is waiting on financial clearance for some things downstairs. They'll keep moving on emergency care, of course, but there are forms, authorizations, all that usual nonsense. Paula looked at Annie again. You should eat while they're still crisp. Annie gave a tiny nod and bit into one cracker. The sound was so small in the fluorescent hush of the hallway that Daniel felt it rather than heard it. He turned the bottle in his hand and studied the waterline. What does your mother do? He asked after a moment. Annie swallowed before answering. She cleans houses. Sometimes she helps an old lady on our street, and on Sundays she sings at church when she's not too tired. Does she know you're up here? Daniel asked. I think so. Annie twisted the little milk carton open. Before they took her away, she told me not to worry if things looked scary. Her gaze lowered to the crackers in her hand. Then she got scared anyway. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. This time Martin appeared at the far end of the corridor before Daniel could decide whether to answer. The assistant moved quickly but not hurriedly, dressed in the same dark suit he had arrived in hours before, one hand still holding his phone, the other a folder with papers Daniel knew he would not read tonight. Daniel, he said quietly when he reached them. Then he noticed Annie eating crackers and Nurse Paula standing nearby. And he adjusted at once. I just got off with the overnight office. There are already calls from New York and London, asking whether tomorrow morning's meeting is still on. Daniel let out a hollow laugh. Of course there are. Martin's professional mask did not slip, but it did soften a fraction. I told them not to expect anything from you before noon. Cancel it. Everything? Everything. Martin gave one short nod. Done. Daniel should have stopped there. Annie was still standing within reach, and Paula's casual mention of financial clearance had lodged itself in him like a splinter. He turned toward Martin fully. I need you to do something. Martin was already prepared. Anything. Go downstairs. Find out exactly what the status is on Renee Carter. Martin blinked. Who? Annie's mother. For the first time in years, Daniel watched Martin struggle to keep pace with him emotionally, rather than professionally. Sir, with respect, right now your focus should be on Ethan. Daniel's eyes sharpened. My focus can hold more than one human being at a time. Martin glanced at Paula, then back at Daniel. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm saying this is not the moment to insert yourself into another patient's financial file. That sentence alone should embarrass all of us, Daniel said flatly. Paula looked down, hiding what might have been agreement. Martin lowered his voice even more. You've had an awful night. You're upset. I understand that. But if you wade into billing or admissions without context, someone will decide you're trying to influence care. Daniel rose from the chair, not violently this time, but with enough controlled force to make the point. Then get context. Martin drew in a breath. Daniel. No. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quiet now, which made it more dangerous than shouting. Go downstairs. Find out what's needed, who's waiting, what's being delayed, and why a child upstairs thinks the only useful thing her family can bring into this building is money. Martin held his gaze for a long second. All right, he said at last. I'll find out. And Martin. He paused. Do it without making a spectacle. A flicker of understanding crossed Martin's face. Of course. When he walked away toward the elevators, Daniel sat back down more slowly than before. Annie had stopped eating. She was watching him with the solemn alertness of someone who sensed an important conversation had happened without understanding all of it. Is that your friend? She asked. Daniel looked toward the elevator doors closing behind Martin. Something like that. Annie considered this, then offered him the last cracker in the sleeve without speaking. Daniel stared at it. He took it gently. Thank you. She nodded, as if that settled it. Across the hallway, the operating room doors remained closed. Beyond them, his son was still waiting. Downstairs, Annie's mother was still somewhere in the machinery of emergency medicine, trying to stay alive long enough for the paperwork of survival to catch up. And in the bright, cold middle space between those two uncertainties, Daniel Whitmore sat beside a child who had given him water, then crackers, then silence, when silence was kinder than questions. If this moment moved you even a little, take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story that reminds us what truly matters. Martin returned 12 minutes later with the look of a man who had walked into a situation expecting paperwork and found something harder to classify. Daniel knew that expression. He had seen it on lawyers who discovered the truth was worse than the rumor, on consultants who realized a minor issue had a human face, on executives who entered the numbers and came back having remembered they were about people. Martin stopped near the row of chairs, glanced briefly at Annie, then looked at Daniel with a care that suggested he was choosing every word before speaking it. I talked to admissions, then billing, then a charge nurse downstairs, he said quietly. Renee Carter was brought in with severe abdominal pain and internal bleeding. They're stabilizing her. She's being treated, but there are concerns about surgery if it comes to that. Insurance coverage is partial at best. There's no authorization on file yet, and the family has no card on record for the deposit. Annie was seated again now, her small hands folded in her lap, as if she had sensed the conversation was important and was trying to make herself smaller for it. Daniel looked at Martin, then at the closed operating room doors, then back at Martin. Is anyone refusing care? No, Martin said immediately. Not emergency care. But you know how this works. The system keeps moving. And then all the secondary decisions start lining up behind it. Transfer risk. Scheduling. Financial review. The parts nobody talks about in donor speeches. Daniel did not answer. The fluorescent light overhead made everything look too sharp, too cold. He could hear an ice machine somewhere down the hall dropping a fresh load into its tray. The sound struck him as absurdly cheerful. Her aunt? He asked. Still not here. Transit delay, apparently. She called the nurse's station from a borrowed phone. She's trying to get in. Annie looked up at that. She called. Paula, who had been updating a chart at the desk, turned and gave Annie a reassuring smile. She did, honey. She said she's coming as fast as she can. Annie nodded. But the relief on her face was only partial. Children understood delay even when adults dressed it in gentle language. Someone on the way was not the same thing as someone there. Martin lowered his voice. There's more. Daniel's gaze hardened. Go on. The billing supervisor downstairs was careful about how she phrased it, but the message was clear. If your name weren't attached to this building in 3 places, and if you weren't sitting here tonight, none of this would matter to you. He hesitated. To them, Renee Carter is another unstable patient from the South Side, with weak coverage and no immediate means of payment. Daniel felt something old and ugly move beneath his ribs. Not surprise. He was too intelligent for surprise. What he felt was recognition of a truth he had spent years hearing discussed as a policy challenge rather than a humiliation. Numbers on a page. Community access. Equity gaps. Resource burden. Those phrases had never sounded like a frightened child waiting for an aunt with money. Annie's eyes moved between the men, alert though she was pretending not to listen. Daniel softened his expression before he spoke again. Can her mother still hear visitors? Paula answered from the desk. Not at the moment. She's sedated while they monitor her. If things remain stable, someone may be able to see her later. Annie took that in carefully. But she's still here? Paula came over and crouched beside her chair. She is. and she's being watched very closely. The little girl nodded once. She did not cry. Daniel had begun to understand that Annie held herself together the way some old soldiers did, without drama, without asking anyone to notice the cost. Before anyone could say more, the double doors to the surgical wing opened again. Dr. Strauss stepped through, pulling off one glove and dropping it into a waste bin by the wall. Daniel rose at once, so fast that the chair legs scraped. "What now?" "She's not here to give bad news," Paula said under her breath, though whether she was reassuring Annie or Daniel was unclear. Dr. Strauss crossed the hall toward them. Her expression had shifted from controlled distance to something more direct, almost personal. "Mr. Whitmore, may I speak with you?" Daniel's whole body went taut. "If this is another delay, it's not." Her tone stopped him. "Your son is being moved into final pre-op now. The recalibration issue has been cleared. Anesthesia has signed off. We are very close. Very close." The phrase should have relieved him. Instead, after the last two reversals, it only sent a fresh wave of fear through him. Close means what? 5 minutes? 20? Another hour? It means I came out here myself because I did not want this message delivered badly. Dr. Strauss held his gaze. "You may see Ethan for 1 minute before we take him in. 1 minute, Daniel. Then I need you out of my way so I can do my job." It was the first time she had used his first name all night. Daniel swallowed. He had spent hours fighting her authority because he could not bear his own helplessness. Now he saw what he should have seen sooner. She was tired too. Not intimidated, not offended, simply tired of being made the face of a system that failed people at the exact moment they most needed certainty. He nodded once. "All right." Then he looked at Annie. He did not know why he looked at her first. Perhaps because he had started to measure the night against her steady presence. Perhaps because in the span of less than an hour, this child had become the only witness to his shame who did not seem interested in using it against him. "I need to go see my son," he said. Annie regarded him solemnly. "Okay." Daniel crouched slightly so he was nearer her eye level. "My assistant is going to stay nearby. Nurse Paula is here. You won't be by yourself." Annie's gaze flicked to Paula, then to Martin, then back to Daniel. "Okay." Something in the simplicity of that trust unsettled him more than accusation would have. She accepted assurance because she wanted to believe adults meant what they said. The least he could do was make it true. He straightened and turned to Martin. "Stay with her." Martin blinked, caught for once without a ready objection. "Daniel, if they're taking Ethan in, you may need..." "Stay with her," Daniel repeated. "And if the aunt arrives, handle whatever needs handling without making those two women feel like Charity has entered the room." A strange expression crossed Martin's face then. Part resistance, part respect. Understood. Paula stood and folded her arms lightly. "I'll be here too." Daniel looked at her. "Thank you." She gave him a practical nod, as if thanks were less useful than follow-through. "Go see your boy." He took 2 steps toward the doors, then stopped and turned back. Annie was still watching him with the grave attention that made her seem older than she was. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said. "Yes?" "Don't yell this time." The words were so unexpected that Martin let out a breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh before he caught himself. Paula pressed her lips together. Even Dr. Strauss's face changed for the briefest second. Daniel stared at Annie, then did something he had not done all night. He smiled. It was not a broad smile, and it did not erase the strain in his face, but it was real. "I'll try," he said. Annie considered that answer and seemed satisfied. Good. He disappeared through the double doors with Dr. Strauss, and for several seconds after he was gone, the hallway seemed to rearrange itself around the absence of his fear. The air was still cold, the lights were still merciless, but the room no longer felt like it was braced for impact. Martin remained standing where Daniel had left him, one hand still curled loosely around his phone. Annie studied him for a moment. "You work for him?" "I do." "Is he always mean?" The question struck Paula funny enough that she had to turn away and pretend to check the monitor at the desk. Martin, to his credit, did not seem offended. He looked down the hallway where Daniel had gone and considered the answer more seriously than Annie probably expected. "No," he said at last. "Not always. Just tonight? Tonight has been hard." Annie nodded as though that confirmed a theory she already had. My mama says grown-ups can get rude when they're scared. Paula let out a soft sound that was not quite laughter and not quite sorrow. Martin looked at Annie with new attention. Your mother sounds wise. She is. There was no boast in the statement, only loyalty. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened again, and a woman in a cheap navy coat hurried out, hair windblown, purse half open, breathing as though she had run from the bus stop. She turned wildly in both directions until Paula called her name. Tanya? The woman nearly sagged with relief. Yes. Lord. Yes. Annie? Annie slid off the chair and ran to her, not with the noisy collapse of a child finally permitted to panic, but with the swift, fierce relief of someone who had promised herself to hold steady until another set of family hands arrived. Tanya bent and gathered her in close, kissing the top of her head again and again. I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm sorry I'm late. Annie clung to her for one long second before stepping back. Mama's still here. I know. Tanya wiped at her face and looked around, disoriented by the polished quiet of the private floor, by Martin's suit, by Paula's badge, by the fact that she had clearly arrived in the middle of something she did not understand. They told me to come up here first. I don't even know what I'm supposed to sign. Martin stepped forward, gentler now than Daniel had likely ever seen him with a stranger. You don't need to worry about that this minute. Tanya's posture changed at once. She pulled Annie slightly closer. And who are you? My name is Martin Cole. I'm helping Mr. Whitmore with some arrangements. Whitmore? She looked around as if expecting cameras. I don't know any Whitmore. You don't need to, Martin said. What matters right now is your sister. Tanya looked suspicious, tired, and one insult away from leaving out of self-respect. Daniel would have recognized the stance if he were there. He had seen it in labor leaders, pastors, and men who had lost too much to let kindness arrive dressed as ownership. Paula stepped in before the moment could curdle. Why don't we start with getting you downstairs and finding out exactly where your sister is? Tanya nodded, still wary. As Paula reached for the phone to call emergency, the operating room doors at the far end of the hall opened once more. Everyone turned. Daniel stepped back into the corridor alone, and one look at his face told Annie that the longest minute of his life had just ended. Daniel stepped back into the corridor alone, and the first thing Annie noticed was that he was no longer holding himself together by force. He was upright, he was breathing, he had not fallen apart, but the effort of containing everything inside him now showed plainly in his face. His eyes were red again, though no fresh tears were falling. He had the look of a man who had just walked out of a room where someone small and beloved had trusted him with fear. Tanya noticed it too. Her posture softened a fraction, suspicion giving way to the instinctive recognition one struggling adult often has for another. Paula lowered the phone she had just picked up. Martin took one step toward Daniel, then stopped when he saw that Daniel did not want information yet. He wanted 1 second to stand still. Daniel looked first at Annie. He asked for me not to leave, he said quietly, as if reporting something solemn and binding. So I told him I wouldn't. Annie held his gaze. That was good. A strange, almost painful expression crossed Daniel's face. Gratitude, perhaps. Or the exhaustion of being measured by a child and finding for once that he had not entirely failed. Then Dr. Strauss appeared again through the double doors. Mr. Whitmore, she said, not unkindly. We're moving now. Daniel turned at once. The hallway seemed to hold its breath with him. Even Tanya, who had no reason to care about a wealthy stranger's family, stopped fidgeting with her purse strap. In hospitals, people become unwilling experts in other people's sorrow. You learn to hear urgency in footsteps, to read dread in silence, to recognize when a family has reached the point where words no longer help. Daniel took one step toward the doors, then looked back over his shoulder. Martin, I'm here. Make sure Mrs. Carter is not left waiting because someone needs a number on a form. Martin nodded. I understand. Daniel's gaze shifted to Tanya. Your sister will be looked after. Tanya's eyes narrowed slightly. Not from ingratitude, but from caution sharpened by years of disappointment. And why would that be? Daniel seemed too worn down for performance. Because your niece was kinder to me tonight than I deserved. Tanya glanced at Annie, then back at Daniel. She did not smile. She did not melt. Women like Tanya Brooks had not survived life by believing rich men meant well. That doesn't answer the question. No, Daniel said. It doesn't. But it's the truth I have at the moment. Before Tanya could reply, Dr. Strauss said, Mr. Whitmore. He nodded once and disappeared behind the doors. This time, when they shut for real. The hallway exhaled slowly after that, like a church after the coffin has passed. Paula motioned Tanya toward the nurse's station. Come with me. I'll get emergency on the line. Tanya took Annie's hand and followed, still clutching her purse under one arm. Up close, under the cruel lights, she looked older than she probably was. Her coat was too thin for the night wind outside. Her shoes were damp around the soles. She had the hard, intelligent face of a woman who had spent half her life doing arithmetic with bills, bus routes, and promises. Annie stayed close to her side without complaint. Martin remained where he was for a moment, one hand in his pocket, the other still holding his phone. Then he turned toward them and said, in the careful tone of a man trying not to sound like a problem, Miss Brooks, I know this is unusual. You think? Tanya said. He accepted that without protest. I only mean that Mr. Whitmore intends to help. Tanya gave a short, humorless laugh. Men like him usually intend to help when there's a camera around. There isn't one. Not yet. Paula glanced up from the desk, but she didn't interrupt. She seemed to understand that mistrust, when it had been earned over years, was not disrespect. It was memory. Martin said, He's not doing this for publicity. That what he told you? Tanya asked. Martin looked toward the closed surgical doors. No, that's how I know it's real. For the first time, Tanya hesitated. Not because she believed him completely, but because something in his voice suggested he was speaking from observation, not loyalty. Annie leaned lightly against her aunt's arm, watching both adults with the solemn patience that seemed to define her. Paula picked up the receiver and placed a call downstairs. They waited through 2 transfers and one long hold full of soft instrumental music that made the moment feel even crueler. Finally, Paula straightened. Yes, this is Bennett on 4. I'm with family for Renee Carter. Can you tell me whether she's still in trauma or if she's been moved? She listened. All right. Any update on surgical review? Another pause. Understood. Thank you. She hung up and turned to Tanya. Your sister is stable for the moment, Paula said. They have her under close observation. The bleeding appears controlled, but they're still deciding whether she'll need a procedure later tonight or if they can manage it without surgery. Tanya closed her eyes briefly. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or just relief, looking for words. Can we see her? Not yet. They're still working. Annie tipped her face up. But she's still here. Paula softened. She is. The child nodded once, absorbing the answer with the same grave discipline she had shown all night. Martin stepped closer to the desk. And the financial hold? Paula's mouth tightened. Billing flagged the chart. They always do. Tanya went rigid. Flagged it for what? Paula did not sugarcoat this time. Perhaps she was too tired. Perhaps Daniel's outburst had stripped the evening of polite fictions. Because your sister came in through emergency without complete coverage and without immediate payment information. No one is stopping urgent care, but the account has already been marked for review. Tanya stared at her. So while she's in there bleeding, somebody's typing notes about money. Paula did not deny it. For a second, the only sound in the hallway was the low buzz of the lights. Then Tanya let out a breath that shook on the way out. That's America for you, she said quietly. You can die while they print paperwork. Martin looked away. He had no adequate answer to that, and he knew better than to offer one. Annie tugged lightly at Tanya's sleeve. Auntie? Yes, baby? Is Mama gonna know we're here? Tanya crouched down despite the ache that showed in her knees. She put both hands on Annie's shoulders and gathered herself before speaking. Yes, maybe not this exact minute, but she's gonna know. Your mama knows your voice in a crowd and your footsteps in a hallway. Don't you worry about that. Annie seemed to accept this. Tanya kissed her forehead, then rose again with visible effort. A volunteer in a red vest passed through carrying 2 blankets folded over one arm. Paula stopped her with a glance and took one. She draped it around Annie's shoulders, tucking it close with the habitual tenderness of someone who had probably done the same for frightened children more times than she could count. There, Paula said. Hospital air conditioning's got no mercy. That finally drew the faintest smile from Tanya. Ain't that the truth? Minutes moved strangely after that, too slowly for fear, too quickly for thought. Martin took a call in a low voice by the elevator, then another, handling them with clipped efficiency. Paula charted, checked monitors, answered questions from another family, then came back. Tanya sat with one arm around Annie and one foot tapping restlessly against the floor. Across the hall, the television rolled through weather, politics, and sports scores from a world that now seemed vulgar in its indifference. At one point, Annie looked up at Tanya and asked, "Do you think Mr. Whitmore's little boy is scared?" Tanya glanced toward the operating doors. "I expect he is. I think that's why he was yelling." Tanya was quiet for a moment. "Probably so. People act ugly when they're scared," Annie said softly. Martin heard it from across the corridor. He lowered his phone and looked at the child with a kind of baffled respect. Then, from behind the double doors, there came a sudden burst of movement. Not chaos, not alarm, but movement. Fast voices, footsteps, a gurney passing, someone calling for a tray. Dr. Strauss did not emerge. No one came to explain. The hallway once again became a place where families were expected to sit still, while life-altering events happened 10 feet away behind sealed glass and institutional paint. Tanya's hand tightened over Annie's shoulder. Martin checked his watch. Paula looked toward the doors, then deliberately back at her charting screen, as if refusing to feed anxiety with speculation. And for the first time since Daniel had gone in, Annie did what no one else in the hallway had the courage or innocence to do. She stood up, took one step toward the surgical doors, and whispered into the cold, bright silence, "Please, let both of them come back." No one answered her, but no one in that hallway pretended not to hear. The prayer Annie whispered into the hallway seemed to linger there long after her voice had gone quiet. No one said anything for several seconds. The fluorescent lights kept buzzing. The television on the wall moved from weather to political headlines no one in that corridor had the strength to care about. Somewhere farther down the floor, a janitor's cart rattled past and faded into the distance. But in the waiting area outside street, Catherine's surgical wing, Annie's soft plea had changed the temperature of the room in a way no thermostat ever could. Tanya drew the blanket more snugly around Annie's shoulders and eased her gently back into the chair. "That was a good thing to ask for," she said. Annie looked up at her. "Do you think God listens in hospitals?" Tanya gave a tired breath that might have been a laugh if the night had been kinder. "Baby, if he listens anywhere, I'd hope it's in hospitals." Martin, still standing near the elevators with one hand around his phone, glanced over at them. He had spent most of his adult life in polished offices and private terminals, in car services and conference suites, where inconvenience was treated like injustice. Yet the sight before him now seemed to interest him more than any call lighting up his screen. A weary black woman in a discount store coat. A solemn child wrapped in a volunteer blanket. A nurse charting under hard lights with her shoulders slumped from too many overnight hours. It was not a world Martin had chosen often, but he was beginning to understand it was a world Daniel had avoided understanding for much the same reason. He crossed back toward the desk. "I got hold of the overnight administrator," he said quietly, careful not to alarm Annie. "I've authorized coverage for anything not immediately handled by insurance on Renee Carter's case." Quietly. Tanya's head came up at once. "Authorized with whose money?" "Mr. Whitmore's. I didn't ask that man for a dime." "No one is saying you did." She stood up so quickly the chair legs scraped. "Then tell him not to do me favors I can't pay back." Paula looked over but did not intervene. She seemed to understand that pride was often the final possession poverty had not yet taken from people. Martin kept his voice even. "This isn't about what you can pay back. That's easy for rich people to say." Tanya's eyes flashed. "They call it kindness. Then later it turns into expectation." Annie looked from one adult to the other, watching carefully. Martin did not react with offense. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Tanya. "Miss Brooks," he said, "if you reject it later, that is your right. But tonight your sister needs care, and your niece needs someone in this building to decide that paperwork should not be the loudest voice in the room." Tanya stared at him. She had probably heard every smooth-line men in expensive suits knew how to give. But there was no shine in Martin's tone. He sounded too tired for theater, too close to dawn for posturing. "What does he want?" she asked. "Nothing. That's not how men like him work." Martin glanced toward the operating room doors. "Tonight may not be how any of us usually work." That left a silence behind it. Annie broke it by asking the question that mattered most to her. Does this mean Mama can stay? Tanya looked stricken. Martin answered before she had to. Yes, your mother is staying. She will be cared for. Annie settled back in her chair as if that single assurance had lightened her body. Tanya sat too, though not comfortably. Her hand reached for Annie's shoulder again and stayed there, more protectively now than before. Paula finished entering a set of notes, then stepped away from the computer. I'm going downstairs for 5 minutes to check directly on your sister. I trust face-to-face updates a lot more than phone transfers at this hour. She looked at Annie. Would you like me to tell your mama you're waiting up here like a little soldier? Annie nodded. Tell her I was good. Paula's expression changed, briefly revealing the woman behind the badge. Honey, I don't think anybody here doubts that. When she disappeared down the hallway, the waiting room grew still again. Martin's phone buzzed twice in quick succession. He glanced at it, silenced it, and slipped it into his pocket. You're not answering? Tanya asked. Nothing on that screen matters tonight. She studied him, perhaps trying to decide whether he was mocking her. You always talk like that? No, usually I'm much worse. To his surprise, a tired smile touched her mouth and vanished. Across the hall, the operating room doors remained sealed. Daniel was somewhere beyond them now, likely having been ushered into the brief, sacred minute before surgery that hospitals granted families like a final sip of air before the plunge. Martin had seen him in many states cool, relentless, impatient, triumphant, coldly amused, publicly gracious, privately merciless, but he had never seen him as he had been tonight, crying in a plastic chair, water bottle shaking in his hand, confessing helplessness to a child. He wondered whether Ethan had seen any trace of that when Daniel entered pre-op. Children had a way of sensing the truth even when adults arrived carrying rehearsed calm like a shield. Annie turned toward him. Do you think he told his little boy he'd come back? Martin met her eyes. Yes, I think he did. Then he has to. The certainty in her voice was not childish fantasy. It was moral logic. A promise had been made. Therefore, the world ought to make room for it. Martin looked away, suddenly unable to explain why grown men stopped believing that. 15 more minutes passed, though the clock seemed to resist them. Tanya rose once to pace, then sat back down when Annie reached for her hand. A gray-haired man in the far corner accepted a phone call and whispered, "Still waiting," before ending it. The volunteer returned with another blanket and left without speaking. The coffee machine coughed and sputtered. Every tiny sound in the hallway seemed magnified by dread. At last, Paula returned. She came quickly, but not in panic, and that alone softened the faces waiting for her. She walked straight to Tanya first. Your sister is stable for now, she said. Her blood pressure's improved. They're still watching the internal bleeding closely, but she's responding. Tanya pressed a hand to her mouth. Can I see her? Not yet. They've moved her to a monitored room. Let them settle her first. Annie's voice came from below them. Did you tell her I was good? Paula looked down and smiled. I did. I also told her you've been brave enough for 3 people. That seemed to satisfy Annie in a way adult reassurance usually did not. She leaned back against Tanya's side and closed her eyes for the first time, not asleep, but no longer braced. Then, almost immediately, the surgical doors opened. Everyone on the floor looked up. It was not Daniel this time. It was Dr. Strauss, moving with the focused speed of a person whose mind was still partly elsewhere. She crossed directly toward Martin. Mr. Cole, she said, I need you. Martin straightened at once. What happened? Your principal needs a decision on an issue related to consent forms and post-op transfer options. There's also a question about blood availability that has already been resolved, but he heard the word shortage and now thinks the sky is falling. Tanya frowned. Blood shortage? Dr. Strauss glanced at her and chose her words with care. There was a concern about timing, not supply. The concern is handled. Then to Martin more briskly, come now. And for heaven's sake, do not let him start negotiating with anesthesiology. For the first time since he had arrived, Martin almost laughed outright. I'll try. He followed Dr. Strauss through the doors, leaving Tanya, Annie, and Paula in the harsh little island of the waiting area. Annie opened her eyes again. He's scared all over again. Paula folded her arms lightly. That tends to happen before surgery. Tanya gave a slow shake of her head. Money sure doesn't save folks from fear. No, Paula said. It just lets them have better chairs while they wait. That line sat in the air for a moment, sharp and true. Annie looked up at the row of donor plaques on the opposite wall. Brass names. Family foundations. Legacy gifts. Endowed units. She could not read all of them from where she sat, but she understood enough to ask, "Is Mr. Whitmore one of those names?" Paula followed her gaze. "He is." Annie considered that. "Then why can't he make them hurry?" Neither woman answered right away. Because that was the oldest lie power ever told itself, Tanya thought. Because men built whole lives believing doors would open when they pushed hard enough. Then one hospital hallway or courtroom or cemetery came along and taught them otherwise. Paula finally said, "Some things can't be rushed, honey. Not if you want them done right." Annie thought about that too, quietly. A little while later, Martin returned alone. He did not sit this time. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked toward the operating room doors as if watching through them by will alone. Tanya read something in his face and asked, "They take the boy in?" Martin nodded. "Yes." Annie's fingers closed around the edge of the blanket. The hallway changed after that. There was no more waiting for the start. They had entered the deeper, crueler wait, the one where action was underway but no one outside could help. Even the air seemed to know it. People lowered their voices. A television commercial for a pickup truck rolled across the muted screen with absurd cheerfulness. Somewhere a clock ticked. Tanya looked at Annie, then at Martin, then toward the floor below where Renee Carter lay in a monitored room with her future resting in the hands of people who had almost let paperwork speak too loudly. She thought of Daniel Whitmore behind those doors, rich enough to command nations in smaller matters, poor as any other parent in the face of a surgeon's hands. And in that strange shared silence, the four of them sat together, not family, not friends, not equals in money or history or race, but bound for one long hour by the same brutal truth. When the body is in danger, every title eventually gives way to prayer. The hour after Ethan was taken into surgery did not pass so much as wear itself down, minute by minute, against the nerves of everyone left outside. By then the hospital had entered that strange depth of night, when even emergency places begin to sound tired. The overhead announcements came less often. The elevators opened onto quieter floors. The cleaning staff moved like ghosts with rubber-wheeled carts and lowered voices. Somewhere beyond the waiting area, a floor buffer whined briefly, then stopped. The television remained on mute, cycling through news headlines no one bothered reading. Annie had finally drifted into a shallow doze with her head against Tanya's arm, the volunteer blanket pulled up beneath her chin. Even asleep, she looked watchful, her brow faintly drawn as if some part of her expected to be called back into courage at any second. Tanya sat very still so as not to wake her. Her own shoulders had begun to ache, but she did not shift. There are moments in life when discomfort feels too small to mention, and this was one of them. Paula returned from checking on another patient and paused by the nurse's station, glancing first toward Annie, then toward the operating room doors. "Any word?" she asked Martin quietly. He shook his head. "Nothing yet." Paula looked at the dark window inset in the far doors and let out a slow breath. "No news is often good news in surgery." "Often," Martin said. She gave him a look that suggested she knew exactly how little comfort that word carried. "You've spent your life around people who like guarantees, haven't you? More than I care to admit." Paula leaned one hip against the desk. "Hospitals are bad places for that kind of personality." Martin almost smiled. "I'm learning." Across the hall, Tanya had heard enough to open one eye. "That man you work for?" she said softly, careful not to disturb Annie. "He ever learn?" Martin followed her gaze to the operating doors. "Sometimes." That didn't sound convincing. It wasn't meant to. Tanya accepted that answer with a tired little nod. She looked down at Annie's sleeping face. "My sister always said children tell you who you really are faster than adults do." Martin slipped his hands into his pockets. "Your sister sounds like a wise woman. She's a woman who had to get wise quick." That sat between them for a moment. Then Tanya added, "She worked nights for a while, cleaning office buildings downtown. Used to come home with her feet swollen and still make breakfast before Annie woke up." Her voice stayed even, but Martin had begun to recognize the effort behind that steadiness. People look at women like her and think they know the whole story. They see the neighborhood, the bus pass, the paycheck, the skin color. They don't see the math she does every day just to keep a child fed and a light bill current. Martin did not interrupt. He knew, with the clarity of someone not accustomed to humility, that he had said too many things in his life and listened too little. Tanya went on, quieter now. What happened tonight with the billing hold? That wasn't new. That's just how the world talks to people like us when we're scared. Paula, within earshot, stopped pretending not to listen. Tanya's eyes stayed on Annie. And the funny thing is, we still come in polite. We still say ma'am and sir. We still wait our turn. We still try not to make trouble. Because when poor black folks get loud in places like this, suddenly everybody remembers rules. Martin felt the truth of that without having lived it. It unsettled him more than accusation would have, because she was not trying to wound him. She was simply naming the weather. Paula pushed off from the desk and came closer. "You're not wrong," she said. Tanya looked up, surprised by the frankness. Paula folded her arms loosely. "I've worked in hospitals for 18 years. I've seen donors get escorted through red tape, like it was lace. I've seen mothers in uniforms wait 3 hours for a social worker because they didn't know the right language to speed things up. Medicine saves lives. Systems protect institutions. Those are not always the same thing." Martin glanced at her. "And yet you stay." Paula smiled without humor. "Because sometimes people get saved anyway. And because every once in a while, on a bad night, somebody in the room remembers they're dealing with human beings." Her gaze drifted to Annie. Tanya followed it. "That child don't know how to be any other way." "No," Paula said softly. "And that may be the holiest thing about her." Annie stirred then, eyelids fluttering open. For a second she looked disoriented, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then the hallway, the lights, the waiting, and the operating room doors all came back to her at once. "Did I miss anything?" Tanya smoothed a hand over her braids. "No, baby. Nothing yet." Annie pushed the blanket down a little. "Can I have some water?" Martin reached for the bottle Daniel had left, half finished on the chair beside him, then stopped. Something about offering the billionaire's bottle back to the child who had first carried it to him felt wrong somehow, too symbolic to do carelessly. Paula noticed and went instead to the small staff refrigerator, returning with a fresh sealed bottle and a paper cup. "There you go." Annie took it with a whisper of thanks, drank a little, then held the cup in both hands. She looked at Martin. "Did Mr. Whitmore yell again?" The question was so earnest that Tanya pressed her lips together. Paula turned her head to hide a smile. Martin answered seriously. "Not while I was there." "Good. You seem very invested in his behavior." Annie thought about that. He was hurting. The simplicity of it landed hard on all three adults. Tanya shook her head faintly. "See what I mean?" Child goes straight to the center of a thing. Annie looked from one face to another, sensing she had said something important without knowing why. "My mama says when people act ugly, sometimes they're asking for help the wrong way." Paula's expression softened into something almost pained. "Your mama should teach half the country." That made Annie smile, small and brief. A fresh burst of movement at the surgical doors pulled every eye in the room. Not the final kind. Not yet. A scrub nurse exited with a chart, crossed to the desk, exchanged quick words with Paula, then disappeared again. Martin watched the interaction too closely. "What was that?" "Post-op room assignment," Paula said. "Routine. Are you sure?" She gave him a look. "No nurse in America says routine. By accident outside an operating room. Sit down." He had not realized he was standing until then. He sat. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. Downstairs, according to Paula's last update, Renee had been moved again, this time to a step-down unit, where they could monitor her bleeding without immediate surgery. Stable, but not safe yet. Better, but not out. The language of hospitals never let families rest completely. There was always another threshold to cross, another set of numbers to watch, another doctor to wait for. Still, Tanya clung to the word stable the way tired people cling to handrails. She turned to Martin after a while. "When this is over, your boss going to remember any of this?" Martin did not ask what this meant. The waiting, the billing hold, the little girl with water, the old humiliations wearing fresh names. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think tonight got closer to him than most things do. Tanya studied him. Closer don't always mean permanent. No, Martin admitted, but some nights leave a mark. Annie looked toward the doors again. I think this one will. No one argued with her. Then, just before 2:30, the operating room doors opened, and Daniel Whitmore came out alone once more. This time he was moving too fast. His face had gone pale in a different way, the controlled kind, and his eyes went first to Martin, then to Paula, then to Annie, as if he had come back carrying news he did not know how to hold by himself. Daniel Whitmore came out of the surgical wing moving too fast for a man who had just been told to wait. The change in him was immediate enough that everyone in the hallway felt it before he spoke. His face had gone pale in a new way, not with the blunt panic of earlier, but with the sharpened strain of someone carrying information that had not settled cleanly inside him. He walked straight toward Martin, then stopped halfway there, as if he had suddenly remembered the rest of the room existed too. Annie was already on her feet. What happened? She asked. Daniel looked at her first. It was becoming a habit now, though he did not fully understand why. Perhaps because she had a way of forcing the truth out of a moment without ceremony. Perhaps because she had been the only person in the building to offer him something simple before asking for anything at all. They're still operating, he said, his voice low and unsteady. Dr. Strauss came out to explain something about bleeding control and timing. She said it's not unexpected. She said I should not panic. He let out a brief, humorless breath, which of course is another way of telling a father exactly what he's already doing. Martin stepped closer. Did she say there was a complication? Daniel rubbed a hand over his mouth before answering. She said there was a moment they had to manage carefully. That's all. She said Ethan is still in surgery, and she wanted me to hear it from her before I imagined something worse. Tanya, who had spent most of the night distrustful for good reason, softened visibly at that. There was no privilege in a parent's fear when a child was on an operating table. Money could buy private rooms and famous surgeons, but it still left people begging for tone, for timing, for mercy in the delivery of a sentence. Paula came toward Daniel from the nurse's station with the calm practicality that had steadied the hallway more than once already. Did she tell you to sit down? Daniel blinked. More or less. Then sit down. Under any other circumstance, it might have sounded impertinent. Tonight, it sounded merciful. Daniel obeyed without argument, lowering himself into the same molded chair where he had cried earlier, where Annie had handed him water, where pride had stopped being useful hours ago. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor between his shoes as though he could somehow read Ethan's outcome in the shine of the tile. Annie took 2 small steps closer. Did you see him? Daniel nodded. Before they started, yes. Was he scared? The question passed through him like a hand straight to the ribs. Yes, he said. He was trying not to be. He wanted to look brave for me. Daniel swallowed. He asked whether it would hurt when he woke up. Annie's face tightened with sympathy so pure it made Tanya look away. What did you say? Annie asked. Daniel gave the faintest shake of his head, almost embarrassed by the memory. I said I'd be there when he opened his eyes. Annie accepted that as the kind of answer that mattered. That was the right thing. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and whatever he had been holding in his chest shifted again. It was one thing to receive comfort from a colleague, a nurse, a pastor, another frightened parent in a hospital chair. It was something else entirely to have a child with no obligation to your pain weigh your words and find them worthy. Tanya noticed the expression crossing his face and said quietly, She doesn't hand those out easy. Daniel managed the barest ghost of a smile. I'm beginning to understand that. For a little while, no one spoke. The hallway returned to its hushed machinery. A volunteer passed with fresh towels folded on her cart. The elevator opened and closed without delivering anyone to this floor. Far away, an intercom called a specialist to another wing. Annie stayed near Daniel's chair, not crowding him, simply standing in the radius of his worry as if she understood that presence itself was sometimes a form of kindness. Martin's phone buzzed again. He stepped a few feet away to answer it in a low voice, then returned with a new seriousness in his expression. Daniel, he said quietly, I just got confirmation from downstairs. Renee Carter has been transferred out of immediate danger for the night. They'll keep monitoring her, but the attending physician is hopeful they can avoid surgery if her numbers hold. Tanya's hand flew to her chest. She shut her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord," before she seemed to remember herself. Annie turned toward her aunt, relief washing visibly through her small body. Paula closed her eyes for half a beat, the way healthcare workers sometimes do when good news arrives and they let themselves feel it before moving on. Daniel straightened slowly in his chair. "Has her sister been told directly?" "Not by the physician yet," Martin said, "but the charge nurse confirmed it." Tanya looked at him sharply. "So my sister's stable, and I'm hearing it from you first?" The question was fair. More than fair. It carried the accumulated insult of 100 systems that had trained poor families to receive their own lives secondhand. Paula answered before Martin could. "The doctor should have come sooner. That's on them, not on you." She looked toward the desk phone, already reaching for it. "I'll make sure someone comes up here or takes you down properly. You shouldn't have to piece together your own family's condition through hallway whispers." Tanya exhaled, still shaken. "Thank you." Daniel watched her for a moment, then he asked, "Would your sister want Annie to see her when it's allowed?" Tanya turned toward him, wary again from reflex rather than anger. "Of course she would." He nodded once, as if filing that away for later. Then he looked at Annie. "That means your mother is fighting hard." Annie considered that solemnly. "She always does." "I believe it." That quiet exchange seemed to settle something in him. The fear for Ethan remained, fierce and constant, but now it was sharing space with a new awareness, one that would not leave him alone. Somewhere below this floor, a woman he had never met was staying alive by grit, medicine, and timing. Her child had sat through hours of uncertainty without complaint. Her sister had arrived braced for humiliation as much as for bad news, and all of it had unfolded inside a hospital that bore his family's donations on its walls. He leaned back in the chair and looked up at the brass plaques across the hall. Family names, endowments, legacy gifts, carefully polished testimony to generosity. He had admired those walls before. Tonight they accused him. Paula noticed where he was looking. "Those names matter," she said quietly. "Machines get bought. Wings get built. Children survive because someone paid for something once." Daniel kept his gaze on the plaques. "And yet a woman downstairs still gets flagged because her sister is late with money." Paula did not argue. "Power could move markets," Daniel said after a moment, almost to himself. "But it couldn't steady a father's hands, couldn't open an operating room faster, couldn't stop a billing system from deciding who gets treated like a problem." Tanya studied him with a long, evaluating look. "Now you're sounding like somebody who finally had to sit in the same hallway as the rest of us." He met her eyes. "That may be true. For the first time all night." She let the edge in her face ease. Not fully. She was too seasoned for that. But enough to acknowledge the sentence had cost him something real. Annie had gone quiet, her gaze shifting back to the operating room doors. "Do you think Mr. Ethan knows I'm waiting too?" Daniel's throat tightened unexpectedly. "No," he said. "But I think he'd be glad to know it." "Then tell him later." "I will." The promise felt binding the moment he spoke it. Paula returned to the desk and made 2 calls in quick succession, one to Renee's floor, and another to someone in patient relations who sounded half awake and wholly unprepared for Paula Bennett's tone at 3 in the morning. Martin stood by, listening, learning more in one sleepless night than he had in years of polished advocacy dinners. Tanya sat with Annie tucked close against her side. Daniel remained in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the doors that still had not opened for him. And when they did open again, it was Dr. Strauss who emerged. This time she did not call from across the hall. She walked directly to Daniel, stopped in front of him and said, "I need you to listen carefully." Dr. Helen Strauss stopped in front of Daniel and waited until he was fully looking at her before she spoke again. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "Your son is still in surgery. He is still with us. We hit a difficult patch, but it is not a collapse. Do you understand the difference?" Daniel rose so quickly that the chair shifted behind him, but this time he did not shout. His hands opened and closed once at his sides before he forced them still. "He's alive," he said, as if testing whether the words would hold. "Yes. And the surgery is continuing." "Yes." Dr. Strauss kept her voice level, not cold, not warm, simply exact. There was more bleeding than we wanted at one stage, and we had to adjust. We are controlling it. We have blood available. We have the team we need. I came out because I did not want you hearing fragments through a door and turning them into a funeral in your head. For a second, no one in the hallway moved. Then Daniel drew in a breath so deep it seemed to hurt him. He pressed one hand to his mouth, nodded once, then again. Annie watched him the way she watched everything important, without blinking. So he's still fighting, he said at last. He is, Dr. Strauss replied. And so are we. Daniel lowered his hand and asked the question all frightened relatives eventually ask. No matter how educated they are, no matter how many polished meetings they have attended in better clothes under kinder lights, if he were your son, would you still be in there? Dr. Strauss did not hesitate. Yes, that answer did more for him than comfort ever could have. He shut his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the panic had not gone away, but something inside it had reorganized. Fear was still there. Love was still there. Helplessness was still there, but now there was also direction. All right, he said quietly. Dr. Strauss studied him for half a beat, perhaps measuring whether he meant it. Then she nodded. Good, because I need you useful, not destructive. She glanced toward Martin. If there are consent updates, my team will bring them. If there are no updates, that means we are working. Don't make me come out here again unless it's for something that matters. Under any other circumstances, someone might have called it blunt. Tonight it sounded like respect. Daniel gave a tired, almost reverent nod. Understood. Dr. Strauss looked toward Annie, Tanya, and Paula, taking in the small knot of witnesses who had somehow become part of this night's strange moral geometry. Her gaze rested on Annie a fraction longer. You keep him calm, she said, and it was not entirely clear whether she meant it as a joke. Annie answered with grave seriousness. I'm trying. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Strauss smiled. Just once, quickly, like a light turning on in a room not built for softness. Then she turned and disappeared back through the operating room doors. The hallway stayed quiet after that. Daniel remained standing for a moment, one hand resting on the back of the chair, his head lowered, as if he were gathering himself from the floor up. Martin waited. Paula waited. Tanya watched with the wary patience of a woman who had spent years seeing whether men would mean the thing they said once the room stopped looking at them. Then Daniel lifted his head and turned to Martin. Go downstairs again. Martin straightened. What do you need? I need you to make sure Renee Carter's file is clean. Not delayed, not flagged, not quietly kicked into a pile labeled later. His voice stayed low, but it had regained that crisp force Martin knew well, the one that usually moved contracts, boards, and frightened vice presidents. Whatever part of the system is waiting for a number, a signature, an authorization, or an excuse, you fix it. Tanya's expression changed instantly. I told you. I didn't ask for. Daniel turned to her, and for the first time all night there was no hauteur in him at all. Only exhaustion, candor, and a kind of stripped-down dignity. I know you didn't. Then don't make this into some rich man's rescue story. It isn't. He held her gaze. Your niece gave me water when I had become the worst version of myself. She did that without asking who I was worth, what my name could buy, or whether I deserved it. I am not interested in rescuing anybody. I am interested in not failing the lesson she handed me in a plastic bottle. That landed in the corridor with unusual force. Tanya opened her mouth, closed it, then looked away for a second. Not because she was convinced, but because she had not expected truth to sound like that. Martin said carefully, Daniel, if I start calling administrators in the middle of the night and forcing changes to a patient account, it can create exactly the kind of spectacle you said you wanted to avoid. Then don't create one. Daniel's eyes sharpened. You're very good at discretion when discretion benefits wealthy people. Apply the same talent downstairs. Paula let out a quiet breath through her nose that might have been approval. Martin shifted his weight. You're asking me to intervene in financial handling tied to emergency care while your son is still in surgery. Yes, you may regret making major decisions in this state. Daniel looked toward the operating room doors, then back at him. Martin, my son is in surgery because there are moments in life when delay becomes its own kind of danger. That woman downstairs has already had enough delay. Something flickered in Martin's face then. Respect, perhaps, or the recognition that Daniel was no longer speaking from impulse, but from conviction. "All right," he said. "I'll handle it. And Martin," he paused, "no cameras, no foundation language. No one says benevolence, no one says opportunity. No one says this is a blessing from the Whitmore family." Daniel's voice cooled further. "Renee Carter is a patient, not a testimonial." This time Paula did smile, though she lowered her head to hide it. Tanya did not smile, but the line of her shoulders loosened. Martin nodded once. "Understood." As he turned toward the elevators, Annie spoke up from beside Tanya's chair. "Is my mama in trouble because of money?" The question stopped every adult in the hallway. Daniel went still. Paula looked at the floor. Tanya's jaw tightened, then relaxed again with visible effort, as if she were trying to answer a child without handing her the whole bitter map of the country at once. Paula came over first and crouched to Annie's level. "Your mama is being treated," she said gently. "That part is true. But sometimes hospitals ask hard questions at the wrong time." "Because we're not rich?" Annie asked. Paula did not lie. "Sometimes because systems are built to notice money before they notice fear." Annie absorbed that in silence. Daniel slowly sat back down. The force had gone out of him again, but not the clarity. He looked at Annie and said, "That should never be how it works." "But it is," Annie said. It was not an accusation. It was simply observation. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "It is." Tanya looked at him then, really looked. She had met men with power before. Employers, landlords, caseworkers, supervisors, pastors with polished shoes, local donors who loved being photographed beside poor children while calling them community. Most of them were allergic to plain truth once it crossed class lines. They preferred kindness that cost little and changed nothing. But this man, for all his money and his brutal earlier outburst, had just agreed aloud to a reality most wealthy people spent their lives paying not to hear. That did not make him trustworthy. Not yet. But it made him possible. She sat down beside Annie again and drew the blanket straighter around her. "My sister taught school music before the district cut her position," Tanya said after a while, speaking into the middle distance more than to anyone in particular. "Part-time church work after that, cleaning houses when she had to. She'd hate all this." Her mouth tightened. Not the help, the feeling of needing it. Daniel turned toward her. "I understand that better tonight than I did yesterday." Tanya gave him a long, assessing look. "No, you understand helplessness tonight. Humility takes longer." To his credit, he nodded. "Fair." That answer seemed to settle something small but important. The elevator doors opened, and Martin stepped inside without looking back. Paula returned to the desk to call downstairs herself, unwilling to trust this matter entirely to men in suits, no matter how changed one of them seemed. Annie leaned lightly against Tanya's side, no longer asking questions every minute, just listening to the sounds beyond the surgical doors. And Daniel Whitmore sat beneath the brass donor plaques that bore his family's name, discovering with painful clarity that money could indeed move markets, influence hospitals, and erase balances on paper. But it could not repay a child's mercy, and it could not make justice less overdue once you had finally learned to see it. By 3 a.m, the hospital had entered a deeper kind of silence, the kind that did not feel peaceful so much as exhausted. The waiting area outside the surgical wing no longer carried the nervous churn of people expecting quick answers. It had settled into something slower and more punishing. A television in the corner flickered through overnight R news no one watched. The coffee machine had gone from useful to bitter. The polished floor reflected the fluorescent lights with the flat indifference of a place that had seen too many families worn down by waiting. Even the elevator doors seemed to open more softly now, as if the building itself understood that everyone left on that floor was listening for a different sound. Annie had grown quiet again. She sat tucked beneath the blanket beside Tanya, hands folded around the paper cup Paula had given her. Though the water inside had long since gone warm, her eyes kept drifting to the operating room doors, then to Daniel, then back again. She was not afraid in the loud way children were often imagined to be. She did not fidget much. She did not ask the same question over and over. She simply watched, as if she had already learned that grown people revealed themselves best in long stretches of uncertainty. Daniel remained in the same chair beneath the donor plaques, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely linked. At some point he had removed his watch and slipped it into his pocket, perhaps because looking at time had become intolerable. His face was pale with fatigue, but the old restless fury had burned itself down into something steadier. Fear was still there. It sat plainly in the set of his mouth, in the fixed attention he gave the surgical doors, in the slight tightening of his jaw whenever footsteps came from beyond them. But he was no longer fighting the room, he was enduring it. Martin returned from downstairs just after 3:15. He crossed the hallway without his usual clipped efficiency and stopped in front of Daniel first, though his voice was pitched low enough for Tanya and Paula to hear if they chose. "It's done," he said. Daniel lifted his eyes. "All of it?" Martin nodded. "The financial hold is gone. The billing supervisor's note has been cleared. Her chart now reads fully covered pending review, and the review will never happen because the account has been moved to private guarantor status." He hesitated, then added, quietly. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Good." Tanya, who had heard every word, straightened. "Private guarantor status means what, exactly?" Martin turned toward her. "It means your sister will continue receiving whatever treatment her doctors decide she needs, and no one from billing will be standing over her bed asking how she plans to pay before breakfast." Tanya's expression hardened reflexively. "And later?" "Later," Martin said. "There will be no balance sent to collections from tonight. No late notices. No threatening letters with bold print. Mr. Whitmore has assumed responsibility." The words did not soften her, not right away. They landed instead in the wary, bruised part of her that had learned help and humiliation often arrived arm in arm. "I didn't agree to that." "No," Daniel said from the chair. "You didn't." Everyone looked at him. He stood, but not with force. He looked like a man who had been awake for a year and aged by 10 of them. "And you're still free not to like it. You're free to question it. You're free to think I'm doing this because men like me always need to feel noble at someone else's worst moment." His voice stayed low, unadorned. "But I won't let your sister's medical care spend another minute in negotiation with paperwork, while my son is being kept alive by specialists in rooms my name helped build." That struck the hallway silent. Tanya held his gaze. "You think money makes the guilt lighter?" "No." Daniel's answer came too fast to be performative. "I think it makes the excuse disappear." Paula looked down, then back up again, and there was something like respect in her face now. Tanya studied Daniel for a long moment. She seemed to be measuring not his words alone but the shape of the man saying them, the loosened tie, the red eyes, the chair mark still pressing a line into the back of his shirt, the strain in his shoulders that money had not spared him. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, not softened completely, but changed. "My sister don't take charity easy." "Neither would I," Daniel said. "That's easy to say from your side of the hallway." He accepted the blow. "Yes," he said. "It is." The honesty of that answer seemed to take some fight out of her. She looked at Annie, then back at him. "If Renee asks me who paid, I'm not lying for you. I'm not asking you to. And if she says she won't accept it," Daniel glanced toward the operating room doors. "Then when my son is out of danger, I'll come explain it to her myself." Tanya gave a small nod, as if storing that promise for later use. Annie had been listening to every word. She looked at Daniel and asked, "Does that mean my mama doesn't have to be scared about money tonight?" The question drew every adult back to the true size of the matter. Daniel stepped a little closer. "That's what it means." Annie lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands, thinking it through with grave care. "Then that's good," she said. No one in the hallway could argue with that. Paula returned to the desk to document something, then came back carrying a paper bag from the vending alcove and a fresh cup of coffee for Tanya. "Peanut butter crackers, pretzels, and a stale blueberry muffin," she said. "It's not supper, but it's what night shift can do." Tanya took the coffee with a tired gratitude that had finally pushed past suspicion. "Thank you." Paula nodded toward Annie. She ought to eat again. Annie took the crackers. But before opening them, she held the bag out toward Daniel. For a moment, he simply stared. "What's this?" he asked. "Sharing," Annie said, as though the concept required no further explanation. He looked at the bag, then at her. Somewhere inside the night's accumulated grief and fear, something in him gave way once more. Not dramatically, not with tears this time, just a quiet, aching recognition that the child beside him kept instinctively offering what little she had while grown institutions all around them had spent hours deciding what must be withheld, documented, delayed, or priced. He took one pretzel, and no more. Thank you. You're welcome. Tanya watched that exchange with a face that had gone thoughtful. She gets that from her mama, she said quietly. Renee never did know how to walk past somebody hurting. Daniel looked at her. I can see that. Sometimes I used to tell her kindness would wear her out. Paula gave a soft, rueful huff. It does wear people out. Maybe, Tanya said. But hard-heartedness wears them out too. Just uglier. That line stayed in the air a while. Martin stepped aside to take another call, this one from someone on the hospital's administrative side who sounded nervous enough that even from a distance Daniel could tell the overnight intervention had traveled farther up the chain than intended. Martin answered in clipped phrases, shut down whatever panic was developing, and ended the call with visible irritation. They're worried about precedent, he said when he came back. Daniel did not even look up. Of course they are. Paula crossed her arms. Amazing how fast institutions discover principle once poor people stop being convenient. Martin almost smiled, but there was little humor in it. They're also asking whether this should be routed through the Whitmore Foundation. Daniel's head lifted sharply. No, that was my answer. No press office, no foundation paperwork, no annual report language about access and compassion. His tone turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with contempt. If a child has to hand a grown man water before he remembers he lives in a country where sick people can be frightened of bills, then that does not belong in a brochure. Paula looked at him steadily. That's the truest thing I've heard in this building all week. Before Daniel could answer, the surgical doors opened again. This time no one stood right away. They had learned too well that motion did not always mean conclusion. But when Dr. Strauss emerged and removed her cap as she walked, every person in the waiting area rose in the same breath. She came straight toward Daniel. He was already on his feet when she reached him. But he did not speak. Annie stood too, her crackers forgotten in her hand. Tanya held her breath. Martin went still. Paula folded both hands in front of her as if bracing the room. Dr. Strauss stopped a few feet away and looked Daniel directly in the eye. The surgery is over, she said, and for one suspended second, the whole hallway forgot how to breathe. For one suspended second, the whole hallway forgot how to breathe. Daniel did not speak. He only stared at Dr. Strauss as though the next 2 or 3 words might decide whether the world still made sense. Then she gave him the answer his body had been bracing for all night. He made it through. The force of relief that hit him was so great it nearly folded him in half. Daniel closed his eyes, and one hand went straight to his mouth. His shoulders dropped all at once, as if some invisible iron frame holding him upright had finally been unlocked. He turned partly away, not to hide emotion this time, but because his body seemed to need a direction in which to release it. The breath that left him sounded broken, almost like a laugh dragged through tears. Behind him, Annie let out a soft gasp of happiness. Tanya pressed her hand flat to her own chest. Martin lowered his head for one brief, private moment. Paula whispered, "Thank God." With the exhausted sincerity of someone who had earned the right to say it, Daniel turned back. His eyes were wet again, but he held himself together enough to ask the next question. And now, Dr. Strauss, cap in hand, looked every bit as tired as he was. There were faint lines pressed into her forehead from hours beneath the surgical band, and her voice, while steady, carried the edge of fatigue no training could erase. Now your son goes to recovery. He is not out of danger simply because the procedure is finished. So, I want you to listen exactly as carefully as I asked you to before. The surgery achieved what we needed it to achieve. The bleeding was controlled. He tolerated the procedure. Those are all very good things. Daniel nodded too fast. All right. Yes, good. But, she said. And the word brought him still at once. The next several hours matter. Recovery matters. Monitoring matters. We will watch him closely. He swallowed, but he made it through surgery. He did. And you believe he'll wake up? Yes, that was enough. Not enough for peace, perhaps, but enough for hope, to become something sturdier than desperation. Daniel lowered his head and let out another breath that trembled on the way out. When he looked up again, the raw gratitude in his face made him seem younger and older at the same time. "Thank you," he said. Dr. Strauss accepted it with a single nod. She had probably heard thanks from powerful men before, but this one came stripped of performance. "You can see him briefly once recovery clears it." "Not yet. Give my team time." Her eyes flicked to the others in the hall, briefly registering Annie, Tanya, Martin, Paula, and the strange little vigil they had all become. "For now, sit down before you fall down." Against all odds, a few of them almost smiled. Daniel obeyed this time without argument. He sat heavily, one forearm draped over his knees, head bent, both hands clasped together, as though he were relearning how to pray. Dr. I2, Strauss turned to go, then stopped and looked at Paula. "And Nurse Bennett?" Paula straightened slightly. "Yes, doctor? Good work tonight." Paula's face changed in a way that suggested praise did not come often enough on the night shift. "Thank you." Then Dr. Strauss left for real. The hallway began to breathe again, not loudly, not joyfully. Hospitals did not permit that kind of release all at once, but something in the space loosened. The fluorescent lights were still cruel. The television was still muttering to itself without sound. The donor plaques were still lined up along the wall like polished witnesses, yet the room no longer felt like it was waiting to break. Annie took a few quiet steps toward Daniel. He noticed her almost immediately and lifted his head. She stood in front of him, holding the half-crumpled sleeve of crackers Paula had brought earlier, as if continuing the strange pattern she had established the moment she first offered him water. "Your little boy was brave," she said. Daniel stared at her for a second, then nodded once. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "He was. You were too." That undid him more gently than bad news would have done violently. Daniel leaned back in the chair and gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head. "I'm not sure that's true." "It is," Annie said. "You didn't run away." Tanya closed her eyes briefly, because sometimes children said things so pure, they hurt. Daniel looked at Annie as if trying to understand how someone so small kept locating the exact center of things. Then he reached out, not abruptly, not presumptuously, but slowly, giving her time to refuse, and rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said again. But this time the words were not for the surgeons. Annie seemed to understand that too. She gave one solemn nod and stayed beside him another moment before returning to Tanya. Martin stepped closer. "I'll notify the recovery coordinator that you're waiting." Daniel looked up. "No calls, no messages to the outside." "Not yet." "Understood." "And Martin?" "Yes?" Daniel glanced toward Annie and Tanya before finishing. "When Ethan is stable enough, I want a full review of every emergency billing protocol tied to this building. Quietly first, publicly if it has to be." Martin did not look surprised, exactly. More like a man who had expected the night to change something, and was now hearing the shape of that change for the first time. "I can start that." "Start it now." Tanya studied Daniel carefully at that. And Paula, standing nearby, did the same. This was no longer only about one frightened family helping another survive a night. Something larger had entered the room. Not redemption exactly. That word was too clean, too convenient. What entered was responsibility sharpened by proximity, the kind that arrives when suffering crosses class lines and refuses to be abstract any longer. Paula folded her arms. "You do that, and half this hospital will hate you." Daniel gave the faintest tired smile. "They can stand in line." That earned him a real one from Paula. Tanya, however, was slower to yield any sign of warmth. She looked at him for a long moment before saying, "You planning to fix the whole country by breakfast?" "No," Daniel said, "just the part of it that sat down beside me tonight." That answer landed differently than the others. Tanya did not smile, but she nodded once, and in her nod was something close to permission. Annie tugged lightly at Tanya's sleeve. "Can we tell Mama the boy is okay when she wakes up?" Tanya looked down at her. "If your mama's awake enough to hear it." "Yes. I think she'll be happy." "So do I," Tanya said softly. Paula glanced toward the clock. "I'm going to call downstairs again." Recovery on one side, step down on the other. Everybody seems to want updates at once tonight. As she turned to the desk, The older woman who had earlier warned Annie to stay away from Daniel reappeared at the far end of the waiting area. She had evidently been sitting farther down the corridor with her own family worry, and now she approached hesitantly, clutching her paper cup with both hands. "Mr. Whitmore?" Daniel looked up. She gave him a small, embarrassed smile. "I just heard the doctor say the surgery went well. I wanted to say, I'm glad for your boy." Daniel stood, if only out of old habit and manners that had survived the wreckage of the night. "Thank you." The woman glanced toward Annie. "And I suppose I owe this little lady an apology. I told her to stay away from you." Annie looked at her without judgment. "That's okay." "No," the woman said, shaking her head. "Not really." "I saw anger and thought that was the whole story." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "You weren't entirely wrong, but I wasn't entirely right either." There it was again. That truth the night kept circling back to from different mouths and different lives. People were never only the worst thing they had shown under pressure, nor were they absolved by one soft moment. Human beings were harder than that. Better and worse. Frightening and frightened. Capable of harm, capable of grace, and often both in the same hallway. The woman nodded at Annie once more and returned to her seat. For a while after that, no one said much. They did not need to. Relief had its own exhaustion. Daniel sat. Tanya sat. Annie leaned against her aunt. Martin took one quiet call, then silenced his phone again. Paula moved between the desk and the family area, making things happen without ceremony, which was perhaps the purest kind of competence there was. Beyond the surgical doors, Ethan Whitmore was being transferred into recovery. Downstairs, Renee Carter was holding steady. Dawn was still some distance off, but the night had cracked open enough to let the idea of morning in. And in that white-lit hallway, beneath the plaques and the muted television and the stale smell of coffee and antiseptic, Daniel Whitmore understood for the first time that survival was never only medical. Sometimes it began when a child saw your suffering before your status, held out a bottle of water, and refused to let the worst version of you be the final one anyone remembered. By the time the hallway clock crept toward 4 in the morning, relief had given way to a different kind of fatigue. It was not the sharp, clawing fear that had filled the surgical floor earlier in the night. That fear had burned hot and loud, making voices rise and hands shake and ordinary people say things they never would have said in daylight. What remained now was heavier and quieter. It settled into shoulders, behind the eyes, into the ache of sitting too long under harsh lights, while the body remembered that dawn was still hours away. Daniel had not taken his eyes off the recovery corridor for more than a few seconds at a time. Paula had explained twice that recovery took patience. Ethan would be transferred, monitored, stabilized, assessed, and only then would a parent be allowed in. Daniel had listened. He had even nodded, but understanding a process and enduring it were two different things, and he was too honest with himself now to pretend otherwise. Annie had grown still again beside Tanya, not sleepy exactly, but worn down into a softer kind of attention. She leaned into her aunt's side, one hand curled around the edge of the blanket, the other resting in Tanya's lap. Every so often she looked toward Daniel, then toward the recovery doors, then down at the floor as if carefully arranging the feelings of the room inside her head. Martin came back from the elevators with a small white paper cup in each hand and offered one to Daniel. "Coffee," he said. "Not good coffee, but it is technically coffee." Daniel took it without looking away from the corridor. "Thank you." Martin waited a second before saying, "I got another call from administration." Daniel let out a tired breath through his nose. At this hour, they're afraid of what happens if you really mean what you said. That finally drew Daniel's eyes toward him. "And do I?" Martin gave the faintest shrug. "Until tonight, I would have said you meant many things in the moment that the morning usually refined." Daniel looked down into the cup. The coffee smelled bitter and burnt. "And now?" Martin glanced toward Annie and Tanya, then back at him. "Now I think morning may have to catch up with you for once." That answer might have irritated Daniel on any other day. Tonight, it only struck him as true. He took a sip, winced at the taste, and drank again anyway. Across the waiting area, Tanya had been watching them in the quiet, measuring way she watched everything. "You two always talk like lawyers at a funeral?" she asked. Martin nearly smiled. "Only when we're trying to avoid saying something honest too early." That sounds exhausting. It is. Tanya gave one slow nod, then looked toward Daniel. Well, one honest thing at a time is still more than most people get. The words were not exactly warm, but they were not barbed either. Coming from Tanya Brooks, at 4 in the morning on a hospital floor where her sister was still under observation, that counted as movement. Paula returned from downstairs with a clipboard tucked against her side and the kind of look that made everyone sit a little straighter before she even spoke. Renee's numbers are holding, she said, walking directly to Tanya first. Her blood pressure is steadier. They're continuing medication and observation. The attending thinks they may have stopped the worst of the bleeding without surgery. Tanya closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, the relief in them was almost too naked to witness. She's really all right? She's not all right yet, Paula said carefully, but she's better than she was, and better matters. Tanya accepted that with the gravity of someone who knew hospitals taught families to live in precise fractions of hope. Annie lifted her face. Can I see her soon? Paula softened. Maybe not right this minute, honey, but probably before the sun comes up if she keeps improving. Annie nodded, absorbing that. Okay. Then, almost as an afterthought, Paula turned to Daniel. And recovery has cleared one parent visit in about 10 minutes. Daniel went still. 10? He repeated, the word sounding too small for what it meant. Paula smiled in spite of herself. That's what about means in a hospital at 4 in the morning, yes. Daniel stood so fast, Martin instinctively reached a hand out, as though bracing for another emotional collision. But Daniel only set the coffee aside on the chair arm and asked, with astonishing restraint. He's awake? Not fully, but he's responding. For a second, Daniel could not answer. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead and turned away. And Annie saw the exact moment the sentence reached the deepest part of him. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. A father being told that the child he had promised not to leave was on the other side of the worst part. When he turned back, his voice was rough. Thank you. Paula gave him the practical nod of a nurse who knew gratitude was best received quickly before the next task began. Sit another minute. I'll come get you. Daniel obeyed, but just barely. He remained standing beside the chair, one hand on its back, eyes fixed ahead. Annie slipped out from under Tanya's arm and crossed the few feet between them. Daniel noticed her at once. Is your little boy waking up? She asked. Yes, he said. Her whole face changed. Not into a grin, not into anything wild or childish. Just a pure brightening, like a lamp turned up. Then you kept your promise. Daniel stared at her. And once again it seemed to Annie that grown-ups often did not understand the size of the things children heard. He had told Ethan he would be there when he opened his eyes. Annie had remembered. To her mind, that was not sentiment. It was duty. Yes, Daniel said almost to himself. I suppose I did. You should tell him I waited too, Annie said. A smile touched his face, tired but real. I will. And tell him my mama's getting better. I'll tell him that too. Tanya watched that exchange with her arms folded now. Not from defensiveness, but because if she let her hands hang loose, she suspected she might start crying from simple exhaustion. Renee was better. The boy had survived surgery. The rich man had not turned cruel again once his own child was safer. None of it was enough to trust the world, but all of it was enough to soften one night. Martin checked his phone and then slipped it away without answering. There's also a message from patient relations, he said. They'd like to connect with the Carter family later this morning regarding support services. Tanya's eyes narrowed immediately. What kind of support services? The kind they usually forget to mention until someone important notices the chart, Paula muttered. Martin did not pretend otherwise. Transportation assistance, short-term medication grants, a social worker, possibly meal vouchers. Tanya let out a dry laugh with no humor in it. Amazing what wakes up when money starts looking at the room. Daniel looked at her. Then we keep looking. The sentence was simple, but it changed something again. Tanya held his gaze. And this time there was no open mistrust in her expression. Only deep caution braided with something more reluctant and more human. She had lived long enough to know systems did not become decent overnight because one man had a revelation under fluorescent lights. But she also knew that sometimes decency had to begin somewhere specific, in one hallway, in one exhausted decision, before it could become policy, or justice, or habit. "All right," she said softly. "Then keep looking." Paula's pager buzzed at her waist. She glanced at it and nodded toward Daniel. "That's your 10 minutes." He inhaled sharply, like a man about to step off a ledge he had wanted to reach all night. Then he looked down at Annie. What do I say to him first? It was not a rhetorical question. He meant it. Annie considered with grave seriousness. "Tell him he was brave." "Then tell him you stayed." Daniel nodded once. "All right." Paula started toward the recovery doors, and Daniel followed. Halfway there, he turned back. Tanya stood with one hand on Annie's shoulder. Martin remained by the chairs, his phone finally silent. The television flashed a weather map over a city still asleep, and Annie, under the bright, merciless lights of St. Catherine Medical Center, stood as still as a witness in church. Daniel looked at her for one more second and said, "Thank you for not walking away." Then he disappeared through the recovery doors, carrying into his son's room the one lesson that had broken him open and stitched him back together in the same night. When Daniel stepped into the recovery room, the world narrowed to the sound of one monitor and the small, unsteady rise and fall of his son's chest. Everything else seemed to recede at once. The hospital, the waiting area, the brass donor plaques, the phone calls, the billing flags, and the polished language in the long white hallway where he had spent half the night becoming a man he barely recognized. All of it fell away before the sight of Ethan lying in the recovery bed, pale beneath warm blankets, one arm taped with lines and sensors. His hair flattened at odd angles, his mouth parted slightly under the lingering weight of anesthesia. He looked so small. Children always did after surgery. No matter how much spirit they carried in ordinary life, no matter how loudly they laughed or ran or filled a room, hospital beds had a way of reducing them to their fragility. Daniel felt the truth of that all the way through him. He moved to the bedside slowly, as though haste itself might somehow disturb the fragile contract Ethan's body had just made with survival. A recovery nurse in blue scrubs glanced up from the monitor and lowered her voice. "He's doing what we want him to do. He's still drowsy. He may not focus on you for long." Daniel nodded, though he barely heard her. He touched Ethan's hand first. It was warm. That fact alone nearly undid him again. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Ethan's eyelids fluttered. Not fully open, not yet, but enough to show that he was still traveling back toward the world. Daniel leaned closer. "You were brave," he said, remembering Annie's words exactly. "You were very, very brave." The child's brow creased faintly, as if the voice reached him before the meaning did. Daniel tightened his hand around Ethan's carefully, afraid of hurting him and afraid of letting go. "And I stayed," he added, his throat thickening. "I told you I would. I'm right here." This time Ethan's eyes opened a little more. They were glazed and heavy with medication, unfocused at first. But then they found Daniel's face, and stayed there for one brief, sacred moment. "Dad?" he whispered. Daniel bowed his head, and for a second he could not answer. He pressed Ethan's hand gently against his own chest and forced his voice to work. "Yeah," he said. "I'm here." Ethan swallowed with effort. "Did it happen?" "It did. I'm okay." The nurse looked up again, but Daniel answered before fear could gather in the boy's face. "You're okay," he said. "You're sore, and you're sleepy. And some very smart people are going to keep a close eye on you. But you made it through." Ethan blinked, processing that in fragments. Then, with the solemn irrationality of a child waking from surgery, he asked, "Did you yell?" The question was so unexpected that Daniel let out a soft, broken laugh. "A little," he admitted. Ethan's mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Mom says you do that when you're scared." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. So there it was again, the same truth from another child, arriving from a different angle and landing in exactly the same place. "She's right," he said. Ethan's eyelids drooped. "Did anybody stay with you?" For a second, Daniel could only stare. Then he thought of Annie standing beneath the fluorescent lights with a bottle of water in both hands. He thought of the blunt little voice telling him not to yell this time. He thought of Tanya's guarded dignity, Paula's quiet competence, Martin's reluctant education, and a whole system revealed not by speeches but by one frightened night. "Yes," Daniel said softly. "Somebody did." Ethan did not ask who. Sleep was already tugging him back under. His eyes closed again, his breathing evened, and the nurse stepped closer with the practiced look that told Daniel the visit was nearly over. "You can stay another minute," she said gently, "but let him rest." Daniel nodded and remained where he was, his hand still around Ethan's. The room was small and softly lit, kinder than the hallway outside, but it did not feel unreal. It felt earned. Every beep of the monitor now sounded less like threat and more like testimony. When he finally stepped back out into the corridor, he did not walk the same way he had gone in. The fear was still in him. It would remain for days, perhaps weeks, in whatever shape recovery chose to take. But the immediate terror had loosened its grip. Relief had entered. Not triumph. Never that. Just relief. Humble and trembling, Annie was the first to look up when the recovery doors opened. Her face searched his instantly, and when she saw the answer there, she smiled. It was a small smile. Tired. Relieved. Entirely without drama. But to Daniel, it felt like sunrise entering a locked room. "He knows you stayed?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "He does. And he's okay?" "He's okay." Tanya let out a breath she had been holding so long it almost sounded like pain on the way out. Paula leaned one shoulder against the desk and closed her eyes for a moment, privately grateful. Martin straightened from the chair where he had been half sitting, half waiting, and the tension in his face eased for the first time since midnight. Daniel crossed the room and stopped in front of Annie. "I told him he was brave," he said. She nodded approval. "And I told him I stayed." Another approving nod. "And I told him someone stayed with me too." That seemed to matter to her more than the rest. "Good," she said. Tanya looked between them with the weary, astonished expression of a woman who had no language for how strange and tender the night had become. Then Paula's desk phone rang, and everything practical rushed back in. She answered, listened, then glanced up at Tanya. "Downstairs says Renee is more alert. Not fully awake, but alert enough that they may allow a short family visit in a little while, if her vitals hold." Tanya rose immediately. "Now?" "Not this exact second." Tanya let out a frustrated breath, then caught herself. "Sorry." Paula shook her head. "You don't owe anybody an apology for wanting your sister." Annie tugged at Tanya's sleeve. "Can we go soon?" "We'll go as soon as they let us." Daniel listened to all of this with the new alertness of someone no longer trapped entirely inside his own crisis. He looked at Paula. "What floor?" She named it. "I want to go down there first." Tanya's eyes narrowed. "For what?" Daniel met her gaze. "To make sure no one speaks to your sister about accounts, balances, authorizations, or payment responsibility before she hears from family." He paused. "And because if she wakes up confused, she deserves to know this wasn't done to buy her gratitude." Tanya watched him carefully. The old suspicion returned for a moment, but it no longer stood alone. It had been joined now by observation, by exhaustion, and by the undeniable fact that he had done exactly what he said he would do more than once already. "You don't have to explain yourself to my sister tonight," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied quietly. "I do." Martin understood at once. This was no longer about settling bills. It was about dignity, about removing the insult hidden inside rescue. He rose. "I'll come with you." "No," Daniel said. "Stay here. If recovery calls about Ethan, I want someone I trust close by." Then, after the faintest beat, he added, "And I want Annie and Tanya taken wherever they need to go the moment clearance comes." Martin nodded. "All right." Paula set down the receiver. "I can take you downstairs in a few minutes, Mr. Whitmore. Let me make sure they're ready." Daniel inclined his head. "Thank you." The hallway settled again. But it was no longer the same hallway. The same lights burned overhead. The same television muttered without sound. The same smell of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to the air. Yet the room had changed because the people in it had changed. Fear had not vanished. Systems had not transformed overnight. Race, money, and power had not stopped shaping who got noticed first and who got questioned hardest. But in one corner of one hospital, something essential had shifted. A man with every advantage had finally looked directly at the cost carried by people without his protection, and he could no longer pretend not to see it. Annie, worn down to the soft edges of mourning, moved closer to Tanya and leaned into her side. Daniel watched her for a moment, then said, very gently, "Your mother is going to know you waited for her." Annie looked up. "Will she know I was good?" The question pierced him because it carried such old, quiet discipline. Not was she afraid. Not did anyone help. Not am I allowed to be little. Only had she behaved well enough to deserve reunion. "Yes," Daniel said, and his voice did not waver this time. "She's going to know you were very, very good." Annie accepted that and rested her head against Tanya's arm. A few minutes later, when Paula returned to lead him downstairs, Daniel paused before following her. He looked once toward the recovery wing where Ethan slept beneath monitors and warm blankets, then once toward the child who had carried him through the longest night of his life with nothing more than water, truth, and the refusal to walk away. Then he turned and went to meet the woman who had raised her that way. The elevator ride down to Renee Carter's floor was quiet enough that Daniel could hear the soft mechanical hum in the walls. Paula stood beside him with her badge clipped neatly at her waist and her hands folded in front of her, a posture that carried equal parts fatigue and professionalism. Daniel stood with one hand in his pocket and the other hanging loose at his side, no longer vibrating with panic, but not yet anywhere near calm either. Relief for Ethan had loosened one knot inside him. It had not untied the rest. "She may not remember much at first," Paula said as the numbers above the door lit one floor at a time. "Pain medication can make people groggy, especially after blood loss and a long night." Daniel nodded. "I'm not here to make a speech." Paula glanced at him. Good. The bluntness of it might once have irritated him. Tonight it steadied him. When the elevator doors opened, the air on the medical floor felt warmer than the surgical wing above, though no less tired. A television played softly behind one half-open door. Somewhere farther down, a call bell chimed. A nurse in dark blue scrubs pushed a medication cart past them with the blank, focused expression of someone operating on the last clean reserve of endurance before dawn. Paula led him toward a room near the end of the corridor. "She's been in and out," she said. "Her sister can probably come in soon after you're done. Keep it brief." Daniel paused outside the doorway. Through the gap, he could see Renee Carter lying slightly elevated in bed, her skin still pale beneath the low amber light of the room. A blood pressure cuff hugged one arm. An IV line ran to a pole beside her. Her face looked sharper than it likely had in ordinary life, as if illness had stripped away every unnecessary softness and left only the outline of a woman who had been carrying too much for too long. Even half-conscious, she had the look Tanya wore when bracing for disappointment, pride standing guard over exhaustion. Paula touched the frame lightly. "Renee, there's someone here who'd like a brief word before your sister comes in." Renee turned her head with visible effort. Her eyes were open, but not fully alert. They moved first to Paula, then to Daniel, and sharpened with instinctive caution. Daniel stepped inside slowly, keeping enough distance that he did not seem to crowd her bed. "Miss Carter," he said, "my name is Daniel Whitmore." Something in her expression shifted. Not recognition exactly, but the awareness that this was a name she was expected to know. It was the same expression he had seen on employees, contractors, junior physicians at fundraisers, people forced to determine in an instant whether power had entered the room as help or trouble. "You at the hospital?" she asked, her voice thin and dry. "No," Daniel said. Then, after a beat, "Not the way it matters tonight." She looked at Paula again, as though confirming this was not some administrative misunderstanding. Paula stayed where she was, neutral but present. Daniel went on. "Your daughter was upstairs for part of the night while your sister was trying to get to you." That brought Renee's attention back to him at once. "Annie? She's safe. She's with Tanya right now. She's been waiting for you the whole time." The change in Renee's face was immediate and devastatingly human. Fear did not disappear, but it softened around the edges, giving way to the deeper pain of a mother who had been unconscious while her child waited alone under hospital lights. "She all right?" Renee asked. "Yes." Daniel's voice gentled without effort. "She's tired. She's worried about you. And she has been very brave." Renee closed her eyes for one brief second, perhaps from relief, perhaps from guilt. "I told her not to be scared," Paula said quietly. "She did her best." Daniel drew a careful breath. This was the moment he had come for, and he understood now why he had needed to do it in person. Money could be transferred in silence. Dignity could not. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'm here because your daughter helped me tonight, when she had every reason to stay focused on her own fear." Renee opened her eyes again, confused but listening. "My son was in surgery upstairs," Daniel continued. "Before that, I handled the waiting badly. Loudly. Poorly. Your daughter saw me in that state and brought me water. She stayed when everyone else stepped back." Renee stared at him for a long moment, trying to make the story fit inside the room she was lying in. Then she let out the faintest breath that might have become a laugh if she had been stronger. "That sounds like Annie." "It does," Paula murmured. Daniel nodded. "Yes, it does." He stepped a little closer, enough that she could hear without strain, but no closer than respect allowed. There were also delays downstairs related to billing and coverage questions. "I found out about them. I have taken care of the financial side of tonight's treatment, and whatever immediate care follows from it." Renee's eyes focused sharply now despite the medication. There it was, the resistance. The old reflex to guard herself before gratitude could be demanded from her. "No," she said, and even weak, the word had backbone. "No, sir, I can't." "Yes," Daniel said quietly, not overriding her so much as refusing to let her carry the insult of this alone. "But not as a favor you owe. Not as charity you perform gratitude for. And not because I think one frightened night gives me the right to enter your life and rearrange it." He held her gaze. "I am doing it because your daughter helped my family survive the worst night of my life. Let me help yours survive it." The room fell still. Renee looked at him with the wary, exhausted intelligence of a woman who had spent years translating offers into costs. "People like you don't do things for nothing," she said. Daniel accepted that without injury. "You're right. Nothing about tonight was for nothing. Your daughter handed me something I should have understood long before she did. I can't pay her back for that, but I can make sure this hospital doesn't punish your family for arriving here scared and underfunded." Paula lowered her eyes, perhaps out of respect for the privacy of the moment, perhaps because she had seen too many versions of the opposite. Renee's lips trembled once before she steadied them. "Annie okay?" she asked again, because mothers often needed the same answer twice before their bodies believed it. "She's okay," Daniel said. "And she asked whether you would know she'd been good." At that, Renee's face changed completely. A tear slid silently into her hairline. "Lord," she whispered. "That baby." Paula touched the bed rail lightly. "She's been worried about exactly that." Renee blinked hard and swallowed. She always tries to be easy to take care of when things go bad. Daniel felt the truth of that like a bruise. Annie had not waited like a carefree child because she had already learned children in hard circumstances sometimes tried to become smaller, quieter, easier, so the adults they loved would not have to carry one more burden. "She did more than that tonight," he said. "She was kind when the rest of us were too frightened to be decent." Renee looked at him for a long moment. Then, because she was too tired to pretend and too honest not to ask, she said, "And what do you want from me in return?" "Nothing tonight," Daniel answered. "Later, when you're stronger, if you want to tell me I overstepped, I'll listen. If you want to refuse part of my help, I'll hear that too. But tonight I want you focused on healing and on seeing your daughter when they clear her upstairs." Renee searched his face, perhaps looking for the angle, the hidden condition, the place where generosity turned into ownership. Whatever she found there did not make her trust him entirely. That would have been false, but it seemed to convince her of something smaller and more important for the moment. "That little girl really gave you water?" she asked. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost turned into a smile. "Yes. And she told me my voice was about to break." To his surprise, Renee smiled too, faint and tired and beautiful in its exhaustion. "That sounds exactly like Annie." Paula straightened. "I think Tanya and Annie can come in for a minute now." Renee's eyes filled properly then. Daniel stepped back at once, understanding the room was no longer his. Before he turned to leave, he said one last thing. "Your daughter is the reason I'll remember this night differently than I deserve to." Renee looked at him through her tears and gave the smallest nod. "Then remember her right." Daniel inclined his head and stepped out into the hall just as Tanya and Annie appeared at the far end. moving toward the room with the fragile speed of people afraid to hope too quickly. He stood aside to let them pass. Annie looked up at him once, searching his face for news, and he answered with a single quiet sentence. "She knows you waited. She knows you waited." That was all Annie needed. She did not run into the room. She did not burst forward the way children often do in stories adults tell about reunions. Annie moved quickly, yes, but with the careful urgency of a child who had already spent too many hours around monitors, nurses, and frightened grown-ups. Tanya guided her through the doorway with one hand at her back, and Daniel stepped aside into the hall, understanding without being told that some moments belonged only to family. From where he stood, he could see just enough through the half-open door to witness the shape of the reunion without intruding on its details. Renee lifted her hand with visible effort. Annie went straight to it and wrapped both of hers around it as if holding on could anchor her mother more firmly to the world. Tanya bent beside the bed, one hand pressed to her sister's shoulder, the other covering her mouth as she cried quietly at last. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just three women, exhausted and held together by love, breathing the same air after a night that had nearly split them apart. Daniel turned away. The corridor outside Renee's room was beginning to change with the first signs of morning. Night shift weariness was giving way to that peculiar pre-dawn transition in hospitals when fresh staff arrived smelling faintly of shampoo and cold air, while those who had worked all night began to look almost translucent under fluorescent lights. Somewhere nearby, a breakfast cart rattled into motion. A nurse laughed softly at something said under her breath, and the sound startled Daniel with its ordinary warmth. Paula joined him near the wall. "You did the right thing," she said. Daniel watched a pale band of early light gather at the far end of the corridor where a window overlooked the parking deck. "That doesn't happen often enough to feel familiar." Paula gave him a sidelong look. "Maybe not, but it can still happen." He nodded, though his thoughts had already begun moving ahead in ways that would once have belonged to work and strategy, but now felt heavier, more human. The billing hold, the late-night calls, the way Tanya had flinched at help because life had taught her too often that debt did not always come in envelopes, the way Annie had asked the only question that mattered, whether her mother had to be scared about money tonight. Quiet footsteps approached behind them. Martin. He looked as though he had been awake for 3 days instead of one night. His tie was loosened now, too. His phone gripped less like a weapon and more like an obligation he was barely willing to carry. "Ethan's recovery nurse wants to know if you're coming back up soon," he said. "I am." Daniel glanced toward Renee's room. "Give them 5 more minutes." Martin nodded, then lowered his voice. "I also spoke to legal." Paula made a small sound of disgust. Daniel almost smiled. "That was quick," he said. They were already awake. Hospitals and law firms attract the same kind of insomnia. Martin looked toward the room where Annie and her family were gathered. "I have preliminary pathways for a private education trust, long-term medical support if you want it structured that way, and an emergency family assistance fund attached to the hospital through a separate vehicle, not the foundation." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Not through the foundation," he said. "That's what I thought. No gala language, no donor dinner, no smiling brochure with phrases like vulnerable communities and access initiatives." His voice stayed calm, but the contempt in it was precise. "If this gets built, it gets built to remove panic from rooms like this one. Not to flatter people who can afford to sponsor compassion after dessert." Paula folded her arms and leaned one shoulder against the wall. "I wish more rich men got embarrassed before they got generous." Daniel looked at her. "I suspect embarrassment may be the only honest place generosity can start." That earned him a long, measuring look, and then the faintest nod. Martin glanced down at his notes, though Daniel knew he no longer needed them to understand. "The school issue," he said carefully. "Do you want me to begin inquiries?" Daniel's eyes shifted toward Renee's room again. "Not today." Martin seemed almost relieved. "I agree, but soon," Daniel said. "When she's stronger, when it doesn't sound like pity. Annie shouldn't receive a future like a handout dropped from a high place." He paused. "She should receive it like a door finally being opened." Paula smiled at that, tired but real. Inside the room, Annie's small voice rose briefly, too soft to make out the words, followed by the weaker murmur of Renee answering. Daniel did not mean to listen. But something in him stilled at the sound. That was what he had almost never heard from his side of life. The private language of families trying to keep their dignity while survival cost them more than it should. A few minutes later, Tanya stepped into the hall. Her eyes were wet, but she was composed. Women like Tanya probably learned young that breakdowns had to be scheduled around practical tasks. She closed the door softly behind her and looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "She wants to thank you herself when she's stronger," Tanya said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "She doesn't owe me that." "No," Tanya replied, "but she'll do it anyway. My sister was raised right." He accepted that. Tanya studied him with the same careful intelligence she had carried all night. "I'm still not foolish enough to think one long night changes the whole world. It doesn't, but it can change a hallway, a bill, a record, a child's memory of what grown folks do when things go bad." Daniel let the truth of that sit where it belonged. "I hope so." Tanya crossed her arms loosely. "Annie's going to remember this for the rest of her life. So will I." That seemed to matter to her. Not enough to erase caution. Enough to make room for respect. "She likes your boy already," Tanya said. Daniel blinked. "She's never met him. She's been praying for him all night." That's practically friendship in our family. The line caught him off guard and, for the first time in hours, he laughed. It was quiet and brief, and still roughened by exhaustion, but it was laughter. Tanya's mouth curved slightly. "There. That sounds more like a man who made it through the night." Before he could answer, Annie appeared in the doorway. She had one hand still resting on the edge of the doorframe, as if unwilling to move too far from her mother's room, but her face was lighter now than it had been at any point since Daniel first saw her beneath the bright lights upstairs. There was no dramatic joy in it, just relief. The kind that settles softly, because it has learned not to celebrate too soon. "My mama says thank you," Annie said. Daniel stepped closer. "Tell your mama she doesn't need to thank me. She said you would say that." He smiled despite himself. "Your mother sounds difficult." Annie nodded solemnly. "Only when people need it." That struck Tanya funny enough to draw a tired laugh from her. Daniel crouched slightly so he was closer to Annie's height. "Your mother also said something else without saying it directly." Annie waited. "She raised you right." For the first time since he had known her, Annie looked almost shy. She lowered her eyes, then glanced back up. "I just gave you water." "No," Daniel said gently. "You did more than that." He straightened and looked at Tanya. "When Renee is stronger, I'd like to come back and speak with both of you properly. No pressure, no surprises. Just honestly." Tanya nodded once. "All right, and later," he added, choosing the words with care, "if you'll let me, I want to do more than cover a hospital night. I want to help make sure Annie gets every chance she deserves." Tanya looked at him sharply, but there was less suspicion in it than before, more protectiveness, more thought. "That conversation happens with Renee awake and sitting up." "Agreed." Annie looked between them. "Does that mean you'll come back?" Daniel glanced toward the elevator, then toward the floor above where Ethan was waiting in recovery. Then back to the little girl whose kindness had rearranged the night. "Yes," he said. "It means I'll come back." She seemed satisfied with that. When Daniel finally turned to leave, the sky beyond the far windows had shifted from black to the faintest gray blue. Morning was beginning to touch the hospital, not enough to redeem the night, not enough to erase what fear and money and race had revealed under fluorescent light, but enough to prove the dark had not won the whole thing. He walked back toward the elevators with Martin and Paula beside him, then paused once more before the doors opened. He looked down the corridor toward Renee's room. Annie was still standing in the doorway, one hand lifted in a small wave. Daniel raised his hand in return. In the weeks that would follow, Ethan would grow stronger. Renee would heal more slowly, but she would heal. Conversations would happen exactly as Tanya had insisted they must. With Renee sitting up, with Annie present, with no cameras and no polished language, and no demand that gratitude be exchanged for opportunity. Daniel would pay the hospital bills quietly, then he would do more. He would arrange for Annie to attend the same school Ethan did, not as a token, not as a gesture, but as a commitment to a future she had already shown herself worthy of. He would establish a fund at Street Catherine's for emergency families who arrived with fear instead of financial certainty. He would make enemies in administration. He would lose patience with legal. He would discover that justice, when done properly, was less glamorous than charity and far more costly. But all of that was still ahead. For now, there was only the hallway, the coming dawn, and the truth the night had forced into the open. Power could purchase speed, comfort, influence, and silence. It could buy the best surgeons, the best rooms, the smoothest explanations. But it could not teach mercy. It could not spot suffering before it became inconvenient. It could not by itself make a man human in the right way. A child had done that with a bottle of water, and as the elevator doors closed and carried Daniel Whitmore back toward his son, he understood with a clarity that would remain long after the night had become story. Sometimes justice does not arrive with a speech, a verdict, or a headline. Sometimes it begins the moment one person finally decides not to walk away. This story reminds the audience that true kindness does not come from wealth, status, or power, but from the heart. In the darkest moments of life, it is often the smallest act of compassion that carries the greatest meaning. Annie had nothing grand to offer except a bottle of water and a gentle heart, yet that simple gesture changed everything. The story also shows that fear can make people harsh, pride can blind people, and systems can fail the weak, but one honest act of human decency can break through all of that. Above all, it teaches that real justice begins when we choose not to ignore someone's pain, and real humanity begins when we see a person before we see their position, color, or circumstances. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.